When I first told people my idea for this episode, I was met with some strange looks. People understood me talking about Poe and Shelley, but when I told them I wanted to do an episode focused on World War I war poets, they were a little confused. So, before we get into it, let me tell you why we're here. In episode 4, I told you about my grandfather and how he would always end meals by telling stories from his life. Well, eating and storytelling weren't the only things me and my grandfather did together. Now, to be clear, my grandfather and I didn't have the closest relationship, but that's mostly because my parents had two kids, so each grandparent kind of picked a child and took them under their wing. My grandfather picked my brother, and the two of them would do things like fix engines and mow lawns and all kinds of other manly things. My grandmother, meanwhile, picked me, and we would do things like gardening and baking and reading and all kinds of equally manly things. Despite this little split, there was still crossover, obviously. My brother has a lot of fond memories of the time he spent one on one with my grandmother, and I have fond memories of the times my grandfather and I would spend together. One of our favorite pastimes was watching the History Channel. Now, I know this is going to date me a little bit, but back then the History Channel was not producing exclusively pawn shop and alien based content. They occasionally covered, well, history. Specifically, World War II history. My grandfather loved World War II history. As a former Marine, he would talk your ear off about every victory the Marines won on the Pacific Front. He would rattle off each time the Marines succeeded, especially if he could use it as an excuse to trash the Navy a little bit. My grandfather didn't fight in World War II. He served a little later on in Korea, but you wouldn't know that by talking to him. If you saw the pride in his eyes as he told you about Guadalcanal or Iwo Jima, you'd swear he'd been there himself. I've often said that my happy place was those Sunday afternoons around my grandmother's table as my grandfather told stories. But those afternoons we spent watching a documentary on the History Channel about World War II hold a special place in my heart, too. We didn't have a lot in common, but for those moments, our passions for history intertwined, and I felt close to my grandfather. He's been gone for over 10 years now, but I still remember those times like they were yesterday. So, I decided I wanted to do something a little nostalgic. Something that combined my love of literary history and my grandfather's love of military history. I decided I wanted to cover a war and how that war changed the writers who served in it. Now, you may ask, given this whole backstory, why this isn't about World War II, then. Truthfully, I don't know. I didn't really think about that until I had already done all the research for this. So maybe we'll cover World War II later. But for now, I wanted to start with the First World War. Too many people, at least in America, overlook World War I. It was a period of tremendous change as the New World met the Old World and forged the foundation for a modern world in a crucible of death. So, in loving memory of my grandfather, I invite you to join me for this 3-part series where we'll look at the lives of 3 English poets who volunteered to serve their country and came out the other side irrevocably changed. Hold hard the breath and bend up every spirit to his full height. On, you noblest English, whose blood is fet from fathers of war-proof. Fathers that, like so many Alexanders, have in these parts from morn till even fought and sheathed their swords for lack of argument. Dishonor not your mothers, now attest that those whom you called fathers did beget you. Be copy now to men of grosser blood, and teach them how to war. And you, good yeoman, whose limbs were made in England, show us here the mettle of your pasture. Let us swear that you are worth your breeding, which I doubt not. For there is none of you so mean and base that hath not noble lustre in your eyes. I see you stand like greyhounds in the slips, straining upon the start. The game is afoot. Follow your spirit, and upon this charge cry God for Harry, England, and St. George. That passage was from Henry V by Shakespeare, as part of the famous Once More into the Breach, Dear Friends speech. Shakespeare, like so many others like him, painted an image of warfare that is made glorious and heroic. War is often portrayed as a necessity that holds a mythical aura about it. War is where boys become men and heroes are made. War is glorious and noble and right. That has been the creed of the poet for a long time. And as we begin our tale, that is certainly the opinion of our three subjects: Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, and Robert Graves. Whether that opinion will last throughout the trials to come, we'll have to see. Let us begin now in the dying light of the 19th century. Alfred Ezra Sassoon, member of the renowned Sassoon merchant family, makes a rash decision. He leaves his family and marries a non-Jewish woman, causing him to be disinherited. But he didn't care. She made him happy. Her name was Teresa Thornycroft. Her family weren't famous merchants, but they were famous artists and sculptors and engineers. Her brother Hamo would design several well-known statues in England and be the first person awarded a gold medal by the Royal Society of British Sculptors. Her brother John founded the John I. Thornycroft and Company shipbuilding company, making a variety of peacetime and wartime ships. Teresa herself was also a successful artist, having already had some of her paintings exhibited at the Royal Academy of Arts. But right now, she's not painting. She's in labor. Not with her first child Michael or her youngest child Hamo, named after her brother, but with her middle child. She will give this child a German name, which would cause him no end of troubles as time went on, but she couldn't have foreseen that. She just liked Wagner's music and thought she'd give her child a name honoring that. Which sounds nice until you really start to think about it. I mean, I have a coworker who's really into K-pop, but if she ever has a kid, I'd definitely be a little weirded out if she gave the child a Korean name just because she likes the band New Jeans. But I'm not here to judge. I'm just here to tell you who this child is and what he did with his life. That child was Siegfried Lorraine Sassoon. We covered the Siegfried, as that's the German name. The Sassoon came from his father, obviously, so we're just left with Lorraine. Lorraine was the name of a clergyman his mother liked. She was a devout Catholic, which had caused the rift between Alfred and his family. Unfortunately, Siegfried's parents would separate a few years after Siegfried was born. His father would die a few years later, meaning Siegfried was left completely in the care of his mother. They lived in Kent, and Siegfried attended the New Beacon School there. As he sought higher education, he went to Marlborough College. Marlborough College is a smoking hot college known today for being a school that several UK nobles have attended, including Princess Eugenie and Pippa Middleton. It's also the alma mater for Anthony Hope before he went on to Oxford. Anthony Hope is perhaps best known for being one of the founders of what is known as Ruritanian romance. Ruritanian romance is a literary genre generally involving nobles of fictional countries that are removed from power and then returned to their rightful place by the end of the story. Along the way, there's romance and excitement and adventure. Ruritanian romance gets its name from Ruritania, the fictional country in Hope's novel The Prisoner of Zenda, which sparked the popularity of the genre. Ruritania, interestingly enough, at least to me, is also used in some writings concerning international law as kind of a placeholder used to indicate a foreign country. So, if you wanted to talk about importing ducks, say, from a foreign country, you might write something like a duck bought in Ruritania is subject to Ruritanian laws, even if it leaves the country, or something like that. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, I'm just a guy with a microphone. Similar to Hope, Sassoon left Marlborough and headed to Clare College, Cambridge, but he would never complete his degree. Now, I know what you might be thinking. He had to leave because the war's going to start, right? No. He just left in 1907 and spent his time hunting, horse riding, and playing cricket. Not exactly gainful employment, but his father came from a rich family of merchants, and his mother came from a family of artists and engineers. He was relatively good money wise. He didn't really have to work, so he simply didn't. At this time, and this is something I wasn't able to fully confirm, but it is possible that Sherlock Holmes author, Arthur Conan Doyle, played cricket with Sassoon. One of the fun little things you see while researching something like this that makes you go, huh. And while Sassoon wasn't necessarily out there grinding it 9 to 5, Siegfried wasn't necessarily idle. He began writing and publishing around this time. His first work, The Daffodil Murderer, was published in 1913. It was intended to be a parody of John Masefield's long-form poem, The Everlasting Mercy. A friend of Sassoon's would later write that the work, which began as a parody of Masefield, quote, midway through had forgotten to be a parody and turned into rather good Masefield, unquote. As rumors of war started circulating, Sassoon, like so many others, rushed to volunteer. He joined the Sussex Yeomanry and was already enlisted when Great Britain declared war on August 4th, 1914. Sassoon has lived a relatively simple life up to this point. He got some education, he had some fun, he wrote some things, and when duty called, he eagerly enlisted. And so, the first of our poets joins the war. He was 27 when war was declared. Now, before we go on to our next poet, let's cover some things about World War I. First of all, who was involved? The general answer is the Central Powers versus the Entente. The Entente is sometimes referred to as the Allies, or the Triple Entente, or the Quadruple Entente, or even the Quintuple Entente. Spoilers, but the Entente will win the war in the end, so they get to have as many names as they want, apparently. The Central Powers at the start were made up of the big three: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Bulgaria would join in about a year after the war was declared, and various colonial and client states would join throughout the war. The Entente had their own big three: France, Russia, and the United Kingdom. Japan would join right away, eager to seize control of German colonies in Asia. Italy would join about a year into the war, breaking its alliance with certain Central Power states after it was promised land from Austria-Hungary, and a number of other states joined the side of the Entente as well, including Serbia, Belgium, and Greece, although Greece had its own complicated political turmoil after the death of their king. The United States would join 3 years after the war started, allying itself with the Entente. And when the U.S. entered the war, a large number of Central American and South American countries joined the war as well, though most did this largely to appease the U.S., and they really didn't get too involved. A notable exception to this is Brazil. who sent officers to the front lines to learn how a modern war was fought so they could be ready to lead a Brazilian force that was being trained. The Brazilian force was never needed, as the war would end before they could arrive, but the Brazilian officers were all noted for their bravery. Brazil also provided ships and participated in naval missions. They even established a military hospital in France, which wound up never making it to the front lines, instead, treating a large number of French civilians suffering from Spanish flu. Now that we have some idea of the who, it's important to me that we talk about the why. When asked the question, what caused World War I, it's tempting to parrot back a simple answer like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Always be wary, dear listener, of simple answers offered for complicated questions. If someone offers you a simple answer to a complicated question, they're probably trying to sell you something. In this case, I don't think there's anything necessarily being sold. I just think we as humans like simple, easy answers. Plus, it makes Otto von Bismarck, former German chancellor and architect of German unification, look like Nostradamus. Bismarck famously predicted a European war and said that, quote, some darned foolish thing in the Balkans will set it off, unquote. But there's two things about this quote. Number one, he didn't say darned. However, I keep my show very PG when it comes to language. Number two, he probably didn't say it at all. While the quote is iconic and incredibly famous, the first instance of the quote is not in German, the language Bismarck would have said it in, but in English. And even then, it's claimed that the author, who I think might be Winston Churchill, heard a German person tell him that Bismarck once told them the quote, which is not a very reliable source of information. So, Otto von Bismarck's legacy will have to survive without potential fortune teller as one of his attributes, and we're free to abandon our simple answer in search of a more complete one. So, let's look at some factors that led to the war. I'm not saying any single one of these is the cause, or even that all of them together are the cause. World War I is an incredibly complicated event that is impossible to pull out of its context. So while I'm going to tell you about some factors that led to the war, just be aware that none of this is 100% of the answer. Life is not that simple. The first factor is the time period. This was, for lack of a better term, an age of empires. Britain and France were spread out extremely far. They had colonies throughout the world, which gave them power, influence, and wealth. Now, a lot of other European states had colonies too, but not like Britain and France. This made the rest of the European powers jealous. They wanted to be the ones to exploit others and reap the power, influence, and wealth from them. This was most notably demonstrated in what is known as the Scramble for Africa. Due to some industrial breakthroughs, Europeans decided in the mid-19th century that they could now colonize or control the entirety of Africa, so the scramble began. France and Britain used their resources and experience in colonization to secure large chunks of Africa for themselves. Other countries like Germany, for example, came into being as a country after the scramble had already started, so they weren't able to claim very much African land. This made Germany very mad. Not because these foreign powers were exploiting other nations for profit, but because they didn't get very much land to exploit for themselves. If you're looking for morally good nations to root for during this war, by the way, good luck. There are no heroes here, just different levels of villainy. The next thing I want to focus on is technology. Now, there had been wars and skirmishes between European powers, but there hadn't been a real continent-wide war since the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. Military technology had advanced rapidly since then, and many powers believed that their technology was more advanced than their neighbors, and a war would allow them to prove it. This combined well with a military ideology of the time called the cult of the offensive. The cult of the offensive was a popular military theory that basically boils down to if you attack, you'll suffer less casualties and you'll win. If you're forced to defend, you're finished. This idea was pervasive, and it made countries wary and on edge. If the only way to win was to attack, you naturally wanted to be the one attacking. And crucially, you wanted to attack before the other side could attack you. Now, not every military mind bought into this, especially those who had studied the end of the American Civil War. By the final year of the American Civil War, things had devolved into an early version of trench warfare, the style of warfare that would go on to define World War I. Ulysses S. Grant is sometimes criticized for how he handled the Overland Campaign, the final campaign of the American Civil War. Some people point to the high casualty rate as proof of his failure as a general. Most military historians, however, reject this idea and say he was a great military mind. And for what it's worth, I agree with the historians here. Most of his criticisms come from people who push the lost cause theory or some the South will rise again nonsense. In truth, I think his final campaign is simply a reflection of what warfare had become. As we would see throughout World War I, there is no way to attack during trench warfare without suffering high casualties. Grant knew this, but he also knew that the only way to end the war was to take land, and the only way to take land was by attacking. Despite Grant's overland campaign being the perfect dissertation on why attacking does not actually lead to fewer casualties, many leaders in 1914 simply chose to ignore it and follow the cult of the offensive. And we'll talk more about the war in a little bit, but for now I want to go back to a poet. March 18th, 1893. Thomas Owen, a sailor who had found his way home, and Susan Shaw welcomed the first of their eventual 4 children, Wilfred Edward Salter Owen. Thomas Owen worked for a railway company for pretty much the rest of his life, even though he found the work quite boring. Susan was equally bored, as she felt being a wife and a mother limited her artistic spirit. She was also a devout Catholic. Wilfred, the first son of these bored parents, would first attend the Birkenhead Institute for 7 years, later graduating from Shrewsbury Technical School in 1911. Upon graduation, he applied to the University of London, and he was accepted, but he failed to attain a scholarship, meaning there was no real way for him to attend. Desperate for a new path, Wilfred agreed to volunteer for the local reverend, potentially setting himself up for a future in the church. His main task while volunteering was to aid the poor and the sick, a very Christian thing. However, his time spent working with the church didn't go according to plan. Working with the destitute opened his eyes and his heart to the dregs of London, but it also opened his eyes to the church's inability to offer any real aid to those in need. These experiences would make him a more compassionate person, but would also lead to him questioning his faith, which he had inherited from his mother. He would struggle with this faith for the rest of his life. In 1913, a little over a year after becoming a volunteer, Wilfred heads back home. He's abandoned his religious path, having chosen instead to pursue something more artistic. He had, at some point before this, discovered poetry, and he wanted to pursue it. Thomas, his father, strongly discouraged Wilfred from pursuing anything artistic. He wanted Wilfred to get a more stable job that provided a more consistent income, which is an interesting suggestion from a man who's consistently described as bored and miserable with his stable and consistent job. Wilfred Owen would leave home and head to Bordeaux, France in 1913 and become an English tutor at the Berlitz School of Languages. He would also privately tutor two boys during his time in France. His experiences there were very enjoyable. In fact, Wilfred Owen would hold a deep love of French people and French culture for the rest of his life. When war breaks out in 1914, he considers enlisting, not in the English army, but in the French one. He ultimately decides, however, against both, continuing his work as a tutor until 1915. At that time, he finally returns to England and joins the war as a volunteer for the Artists' Rifles. He was 22 at the time. Now, despite downplaying the importance of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand earlier, I'll admit that it does offer us a nice starting point. On June 28, 1914, after a series of nonsensical and unlikely events, the Black Hand succeeds in assassinating the Archduke. It's genuinely an unbelievable story, and I highly encourage you to look into it. But for our purposes, we're going to skirt right past it and move on to the aftermath. Austria-Hungary, the country that Franz Ferdinand was the Archduke of, links the assassination to the nation of Serbia. The connection is iffy, but that's not really the point. Austria-Hungary blames Serbia. So for all intents and purposes, Serbia did it. Before acting, Austria-Hungary checks in with its most powerful ally, Germany, to see if they're okay with what's to come. Germany offers Austria-Hungary a, quote, blank check to help fight the potential war. Empowered by Germany, Austria-Hungary makes a list of 10 demands. As Austria-Hungary drafts these demands, France and Russia start talking and making sure they're on the same page if this all eventually leads to war. Austria-Hungary finishes its demands and delivers them on July 23, 1914. Serbia is given 48 hours to respond. Europe as a whole largely agrees that the demands are harsh. Serbia, not wanting to accept the demands, reaches out to Russia and asks if Russia would support them if it came to war. Russia bluntly tells Serbia no, and tells them to accept the demands and hope international pressure causes things to get better. Now, before we get to what Serbia actually does, let's cover the actual demands, because they're often overlooked. To quickly simplify them, they are as follows. Number 1. Suppress anti-Austria-Hungary press. Number 2. Dissolve an organization known as the People's Defense. Number 3. Eliminate all propaganda against Austria-Hungary from Serbian textbooks and public documents. Number 4. Remove certain people that Austria-Hungary will name at a later date from the military and government. Number 5. Allow Austro-Hungarian representatives into the country to monitor anti-Austria-Hungary propaganda. Number 6. Put all assassination collaborators on trial and allow Austro-Hungarian police officers to be a part of your investigation. Number 7. Arrest 2 people Austria-Hungary believed were partially responsible. Number 8. Stop officially supporting weapon trafficking across the border. Number 9. Provide a solid explanation for why some Serbian officials declared themselves as, quote, hostile to Austria-Hungary in previous statements. And number 10. Tell Austria-Hungary when you've done the other 9. Now, what would your response be if you were in control of Serbia? Would you accept these ultimatums to avoid war? Keep in mind that some of them stomp all over your national sovereignty and basically reduce you to a puppet state under Austria-Hungary. In fact, they were crafted to do pretty much exactly that. Austria-Hungary knew that Serbia would never accept these demands, giving Austria-Hungary a solid justification for war, basically saying, well, we tried to do this peacefully, but they refused our deal, so we had to go to war. At this point, war was coming one way or another. This whole preamble and demands and all this stuff is basically just theater, designed to sway public and international opinion. To the shock of literally everyone, Serbia accepts 9 of the 10 demands. They agreed to everything except number 6, which was allowing Austro-Hungarian police officers to aid in their investigation. When Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany reads the Serbian response on July 26th, he is shocked and openly admits that there is no longer a cause for war. He writes to Austria-Hungary, telling them that war is no longer an option. However, his letter is read by German military officials and diplomats, and they all agree that that's a stupid thing to say, so they edit that part out of the Kaiser's letter. So, on July 28th, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Immediately after that, they realize that they won't actually be ready to fight until August 12th, causing Germany to facepalm. That's a trend that will continue pretty much throughout the war. In the meantime, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and Emperor Nicholas II of Russia, or Willie and Nicky as they call each other, write letter after letter over the next few days trying to get the other one to back down. They are third cousins, after all. But come July 31st, Russia and Germany order a full mobilization, and the first steps of the war have been taken. There is no backing down now. August would see war being officially declared by the other European states, and the war was on. Now it's time for us to go back in time one last time and to look at one last Alfred. Alfred Percival Graves and Amelie von Ranke welcomed a boy named Robert on the 24th of July, 1895. Robert von Ranke Graves was Alfred's 8th child. Now you'd think 8 would be enough, but he would go on to father 2 more, bringing his total up to a nice round 10. Alfred Graves was a well-known poet and songwriter who focused his efforts on Gaelic history and reviving Gaelic culture, an interest his son would later adopt. Now you may think that 10 children is a lot, but when you look at Robert's childhood, it makes some sense. He was very sickly as a child. At one point, he nearly died when he caught measles, and then immediately afterwards, caught double pneumonia. If your kids are going to go around being that sick, probably smart to have some backups. Young Robert would survive his illness, but he would continue to have issues with his lungs throughout his life. Throughout his childhood, Robert Graves attended 6 different preparatory schools. His early interests were in poetry and boxing. At one of his schools, he became the boxing champion. When he was later asked why he was so interested in boxing, Robert attributed it to the bullying and persecution he faced due to his German middle name. There was a strong anti-German sentiment in England at the time, even before the war. And with a middle name like von Ranke, Robert was easily shoved into the German box. So as a schoolboy, Robert boxed, he wrote poetry, and he sang in the school choir. He would have several crushes on boys throughout his school years, but it was in the choir he met his first love, future politician G.H. Johnston. Graves would maintain throughout his life that the relationship with him and Johnston was chaste and not sexual. He chalks up these early flirtations with boys as a product of the exclusively male school system. Later in his life, he would basically argue that making boys spend time exclusively around other boys and constantly describing girls as icky led to most English schoolboys being, for lack of a better word, a little gay. When those hormones start kicking in and girls are forbidden and icky, it only seems natural to pursue other boys. Graves describes his younger self as a proto homosexual, though if you look at his life as a whole, he's probably best described as bisexual. But that's as deep as I think I want to get into Graves' love life, at least for now. He's a kid, still figuring things out. When he's older, I'm sure his relationships will be much more sensible and not at all insane. That's called foreshadowing, dear listener. While Graves enjoyed poetry, he was only really exposed to older poems. That is, until George Mallory came into his life. George Mallory was a tutor at Graves' school and introduced Graves to modern literature. Now, if you've got a feeling like you know the name George Mallory from somewhere, it's possible you do. I knew who he was when I saw his name show up in my research, but I did a brief survey of some friends and family, and the results were mixed in terms of people who knew who he was. So, for those of you who don't know, or those of you who need a refresher, let's cover him quickly. George Mallory, first of all, was a school tutor for Robert Graves. He was also a passionate climber. He would regularly take students, Graves included, climbing during school breaks. He was a proud member of the Alpine Club, which was a British mountaineering club, and because of this, Mallory was selected to be a part of the first few expeditions up Mount Everest. This is after the war, if you were curious. Now, if you look at the list of the people in that first expedition, you see some careers that make sense. There are doctors, and scientists, and soldiers. That all kind of makes sense for who you would send up a mountain. The only person who doesn't fit one of those boxes? George Mallory, school teacher. Which makes it even more insane when you learn that by the end of the first expedition, Mallory was basically in charge and the lead climber. Now, we're not going to go into too much detail on the climbing since I'm incredibly unqualified to talk about hiking. I mean, I get out of breath walking up a flight of stairs. Instead, I'll offer you two final facts on Mallory for now. Number one, when asked why he wanted to climb Everest, Mallory famously responded, "Because it's there." And if that doesn't sum up the human desire for exploration, I don't know what does. Number two, we'll talk about his death. During an attempt to reach the summit of Mount Everest, George Mallory and his climbing partner, Andrew Irvine, died. For the last 100 years, their deaths and final actions have been heavily debated and theorized about. This is because it's possible that Mallory and Irvine were actually the first people to reach the summit of Mount Everest. If they did, they would have beaten Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, the two people credited with being the first, by 30 years. Now, do I think he made it? I don't have a clue. The only thing we really know for sure is that he didn't make it back. His body was discovered and identified on Everest about 30 years ago. Irvine's body is still missing. And no, that's not suspicious. Most people that die on Everest are never found. Robert Graves, the poet we were talking about, enjoyed going climbing with Mallory. Graves developed a love for climbing and called it the sport that, quote, made all others seem trivial, end quote. So, Graves spent his time boxing, climbing, and writing poetry. All of these things combined to earn him an exhibition to St. John's College, Oxford. An exhibition is just a different word for a small scholarship. Before Graves could use his exhibition, however, war broke out. Graves signed up instantly and joined the Royal Welsh Fusiliers in August of 1914 as a second lieutenant. He was 22 at the time. Well, our three war boys have all joined the war. They are young and bright and have passion in their hearts and the future on their minds. And yet, by the time we're done, dear listener, you'll know why it took me so long to finish these episodes. Because while I've seen their shining happy faces, bright and eager and so full of hope, I've also seen what's to come. We're going to end today's episode with one of Robert Graves' poems from his schoolboy days, titled Willory. By the time we're done with this series, try to remember that this is how things started. Innocent, passionate, oh so very young. On the rough mountain wind that blows so free rides a little storm sprite whose name is Willory. The fleecy cloudlets are not his, no shepherd is he, for he drives the shaggy thunderclouds over land and sea. His home is on the mountain top, where I love to be, amid gray rocks and brambles and the red rowan tree. He whistles down the chimney, he whistles to me, and I send a greeting back to him, whistling cheerily. The great elms are battling, waves are on the sea, loud roars the mountain wind. God rest you, Willory. Thank you for listening. This has been part 1 of my 3-part series on World War I war poets. Join me next week as the Great War begins and our boys face the grim reality of modern warfare. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or suggestions for a storyteller for me to cover in the future, feel free to reach out on Twitter at StoryOfStoryTLR. Or, if you've abandoned Twitter, which is completely reasonable, feel free to email me at storyofthestorytellers@gmail.com. Finally, to steal a quote from a pair of goose, Soupy Twists.